Welcome to the Geekery in General podcast. I am your host, Al, and joining me, I have a special guest today, a man who's partially responsible for some of the quarters that I lost to the arcades back in the 80s and early 90s. Colin, a legendary video game designer. So how are you doing today, Brian?
I am doing well. I've got grandchildren in the house today, both my new grandchildren, so I'm a little exhausted, but other than that, doing well.
Yes, I have some friends who've said that, who are older than me, who actually have grandkids. They're always like, if grandchildren were this much fun, I would have had them first. So
very well said. Back when I could still keep up with them. They're only two. They're both around two, and boy, they can move faster than I can.
Yes, back when my son was younger and we would have him at his grandparents' house for babysitting. Yeah, they would tell me all about how he would keep them on their toes.
And after they're gone, then I'm flat on my back. But other than that, they're great. And I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Brian is a longtime video game designer, and I think you've been in it since about the, early 80s?
I fell backwards into it in 1982. I was hired as an animator, first of all, by the Bally Midway Company, and then kind of became a game designer out of self-defense.
So out of self-defense, there must be an interesting story behind that. Well,
not really. You decide whether it's an interesting story or not, but I'll tell you anyway. I was a filmmaker. I went to school for film. Other films that I did, I had an animated film that I did that won international awards. And because I could draw, I'm a cartoonist, artist, but I was a filmmaker. And I saw an ad for the Bally Midway Company saying they were looking for an animator. And I thought, what would a pinball company want with an animator? And so I went in there and they said, we've seen your animated award-winning film, and we want you to do art for video games, animation for video games. And this is 1982, and I'm going, really? Pac-Man? You need someone to do that? Well, that's what I thought. I didn't say that because they were willing to pay me actual money. And at the time, out of college, I was basically working for free beer and pretzels. So I took the job and I was convinced I was not going to like it because I have kind of a pen and ink cartoon style. And I thought childhood was over. This is it. I've got a real job. I mean, I actually choked up a little bit when they offered me the job, and boy, was I wrong. It was never anything like a real job. And from the first moment, I knew childhood was never going to be over because I was creating stuff in the morning and I was playing it in the afternoon, literally handing, the floppy disk across the hall. And then I get to stand there and play it at the arcade game and see what would make it better, what speeds. And as an animator, that's kind of the follow-up of why I became a game designer out of self-defense was initially as an animator, the programmer, I worked on virtually every game that was being worked on. There were only a couple of us animators when I first started. So I got to work on everything, and some guys knew exactly what they wanted. And other guys, well, let's try this. That didn't work. No, let's try this. No, that didn't work. Well, let's try this. No, that didn't work. So some guys were very open to suggestions. The little character falls off the side of the platform, and it was kind of an annoyance as a play element when I'm testing my animation. So I'd say to the programmer, well, why don't we just have him waggle his arms a little bit before he actually falls off to give the player an indication that he better move? And so you got to contribute design elements to games like one of the first games I worked on was Discs of Tron and Spy Hunter. And the animators contributed quite a bit to games like those. And in other cases where guys were just trying stuff over and over and over, you knew these games were never going to get produced because they didn't know what they were doing. So over the first couple of years, I became a game designer out of self-defense because I didn't want to work on something that wasn't going to get released. I wanted to work on the Discs of Tron and the Spy Hunters and the ones where the whole team would come in and make suggestions, and the programmers were receptive, because it was in those early days at Bally Midway, it was very much a peer-to-peer. We were all pretty much on the same level. Management left us alone. It was a brand new development company. And we all kind of would talk to each other about stuff and say, can we do this? Who's going to stop us? Let's try it. So it was a wonderful time in the video game industry for me, especially falling backwards into it. And they were very open to me saying, that's a great looking game, but the art, that this someone else had done before I was hired is very generic looking. Why don't we make a little cartoon character? And I would do it. And much to my amazement, they'd reskin the game, and then it would go out and earn enough money to go into production. So and that's the whole story behind the out of self-defense comment, because really that is part of what made the game, the game industry, perfect for me, because not only was I using talents that I enjoyed using personally, my artistic talents, I was getting to push on the creative envelope. I could push against the box, and the creative challenges for me over the years, that's even more fun than the art. So I've been lucky on two levels.
Now you mentioned that, working for Beer and Pretzels. So is that the early 80s equivalent of how nowadays people say they'll pay artists with exposure?
Not so much. I did ads in college for newspaper ads, and they became quite popular. And I did get paid for them. And I did have enough sense to put copyright in my name, saying, now, if you want to pay me what's right, it's copywritten in your name. If you want to pay me $25 an ad, okay, that's great money for a kid in college back in those days when beers were still a quarter. But then I'd put a copyright it in my name, and they would all take the cheaper thing, which meant that after I left college, if that particular tavern or that particular pizza place wanted to replay my ads, they had to pay me again. So I was a little bit smart back then, but I was never, as a young artist, and a lot of creatives do this to themselves, because I'm enjoying what I do, you didn't really feel like you should get paid too much. And then Bally Midway was the first place that says, no, we're paying you salary. We're paying you a whopping $13,000 a year. And to a kid in 1982, that was like, wow, I can't possibly turn this down, whether I want to be in this industry or not. It was great. And I've been so lucky. I've been so blessed. Just fell into it at the right time.
I think it was Confucius, but there's a saying that, choose a job you love and you'll never work another day in your life. So, that is always great when you can find a job that, not only do you enjoy doing, but actually pays the bill as well. And one of the things you mentioned, which I thought was interesting, like, okay, if you have a character on the edge of a platform, have them like stop and shake their arms or something. And, I think, as someone who's played a lot of video games, that's something that I really don't think about, but I can understand as an animator and an artist, it's one of those little artistic flares you can put that really adds interest to the game, as well as, giving the player, a clue that, okay, maybe you should back off a little bit.
Well, and that's what was nice, and for me, very wonderful and surprising, because there weren't really video games of too many before I joined the industry, and I was not a video game player. I was a pinball player. I played Pong, and that was about it. But then as I do the art that was requested, and then you put it in, the programmer who was that first guy I worked with was Disatron, Bob Dinnerman. Brilliant guy, knew just what he wanted, but he was focused on, this is exactly what I want. And then I'm coming across the hall, like I say, in the afternoon, and I get the animation in. But for me, a non-video game player, I'm frustrated when my guy gets to the end and falls off. So my contribution, which I wasn't thinking in big design terms then, I was just thinking, hey, Bob, I'm falling off here, and I don't know at what point you, the programmer, say I'm going to go. So if we add this, And, back then we had very little resources. He's like, okay, you've got about 3 frames to do it with. So as an animator who's used to 24 frames a second, it's just like, I can do it in 3 frames, but here's how we've got to do it. So it becomes a collaborative thing, which I found, personally rewarding. And the fact that I made it better for a player, even if it was a player as bad as I was, I knew I was making a little, and then both of us, and again, working with all the different programmers on everything, that back and forth can sometimes be collaborative, sometimes it's confrontational. But when you both are looking at it from a different way than you've been seeing it, and you both look into each other's eyes and go, oh, you both get that charge of, man, we just now we know exactly what we need to do. And it's very rewarding, and it's an extra charge, even from, I'm getting paid for this and I love what I do. And now right here, the 2 of us or the 3 of us have just come up with something that says the player's going to love this because we love it. And that makes the whole process fun to work on. Because in those early days at Bally Midway, it was the Wild West, and it really was everybody helping everybody else. And a lot of other companies that I've worked with over the years are not necessarily like that. And then especially now, back then, a game like Rampage, 3 of us did all the art, the sounds, and the programming for the game. And it's always a team process, but everybody else on the floor is coming in and saying, hey, wouldn't this be cool? Or hey, wouldn't that be cool? And now these days you've got hundreds of people, and their job is even though it's a very important job on these big, wonderful, rich games, I work on water effects every day of my life, or on this game for 2.5, 3 years. That was not my experience as an animator, because I'm working on the people and the fonts and the cars and the explosions, and somebody else might be a little better than that. So you'd pull that animator in and said, oh no, you got to do the cars. Or somebody else would say, you got to come over here and create the cartoony stuff, or the stuff we got to laugh at.
You do bring up an interesting point, how you said, like, when you're working on Rampage, there were only, in some of these early games, the teams were a lot smaller, and how, you look at some of the major titles released nowadays, there's dozens and dozens of people working on them, like water effects. I mean, I can understand how, if you're trying to make it look photorealistic, that could be really tough to animate. And, but then again, I suppose there's also this whole different age, because what wasn't, like, Space Invaders one of the first commercial video games released, and that was 79?
And on these questions, I'm going to warn you right now. I fell backwards, like I said, into this industry. I never followed the industry. What I know about the industry now comes from people like you that will ask intelligent questions and ask me dates, and I never have a clue. Space Invaders was one of the earlier popular games. And when I say that, by the time I was in the industry, I found out later, people who follow this, this industry and write about this industry, they'll say, oh, you joined when arcades were failing at the beginning of the 80s. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I created some of the best-selling arcade games, highest-earning arcade games of the 80s and into the, games into the 90s. So I didn't know where I was. I didn't know that the arcade industry was failing. I just knew, or on its downward slide. I did know that home games were coming up, and that I know my management at various times would talk about it and would be worried about it. But for me, I was just getting to do all this stuff on all these games every day and getting paid for it. So games like Space Invaders, which, came from somewhere else, they weren't done in-house at Bally Midway. Bally Midway's first in-house development team here in Chicagoland was started the year before I was hired. They did Tron. And then I was hired because some of the people working on that game didn't care for the kind of very jerky animation. And because I was an animator who did cartoon style animation, they wanted me to come in and join the team. So I don't really know, But I knew enough about what I'd seen when I was in college and seeing a few video games that, like I may have mentioned earlier, this one game was doing poorly out on test, and I liked the game mechanic. It was fun to play, but it looked like Space Invaders and like 10 other games that looked like Space Invaders. So when I came up with this little character, management loved it, had me reskin the game, and now instead of doing it poorly, it out on test, it did well. And what I really try to impress upon people when I talk about the difference between then and now is I'd only been working there a few months, and they let me do this to a whole game. And it worked, which is great. I've done my share of turkeys too. You can't just go by the hit games I'm known for. But in this case, it did well. They went into production, and that's how much freedom we were given because there was no middle management. There was the top guys in the company who would come by every month or two to look at things. And there were the rest of us kids all in this place going, what are we going to do next? Hey, let's try this. We'd ask, management would hire a programmer, and all of a sudden we're doing a game that I did a character for. I hate to repeat myself again and again, but it was a wonderful time, and I was very lucky that I fell into it when I did, because I was allowed to become an artist who became a game designer in just a matter of a couple of years. And when I was hired, they didn't really call anybody a game designer. You're a programmer, you're a sound engineer, you're a mechanical engineer, you're an art animator. And that changed within the first few years I was there. And it's very rewarding because I didn't know what was going on in the rest of the industry. I knew what was going on at Bally Midway and the fun we were all having. And not every place was like that. It was really a great time.
In some ways, would you consider yourself a pioneer? Because, again, I don't remember the exact dates. I just remember video games becoming more common in the late 70s. So, you get your start in 82, 83, it's still, the video game arcade industry was still fairly young at that point.
I've been called a pioneer. I didn't think of myself that way at the time, but it was part of my nature. My nature has always been, if there's something out there like it, why do I want to do something like it? When I would go to a trade show, I'd go up and down every aisle. I would try every game. Mainly what I was looking for was I'd always have ideas for games, because idea is the easy part. The hard part is making it into something real. And I would walk up and down the aisles, and I would see if someone had a hit game, there'd be 20 copies of it. And I'd walk up and down the aisles to make sure that nobody was working on anything like what I wanted to work on next. So, and then in retrospect, I was a pioneer because when I started, a lot of the games that you talk about, like Space Invaders or Pac-Man, was all about a person getting a high score. And from the start, I was always about, let's get multiple people playing against each other and let's make them laugh. Let's make it entertainment. Part of that came from my cartoony art style. I never really thought of myself as an artist, more like a cartoonist. But a lot of that was from, I understood, mechanical engineer in those early days, name was George Gomez. He's still making games. He was they called him a mechanical engineer back then. He designed controls, but he was kind of, in some ways, the heart of that early development team. And he said it best. We have two clients. The guy who's going to buy the arcade game and spend $4,000 and wants the player kicked off in 30 seconds so he can get that next quarter. And the player who for that quarter wants to live forever. And we have to make them both happy. And that was kind of, that feeling, that attitude says, okay, what can we do? And because I wasn't a big video game player, I didn't care about score, but I cared about what's going to keep them wanting to put in that next quarter. And for me, that was humor. And that's what I think the 80s brought that the earlier, late 70s, early 80s games didn't have, was everybody was fighting for a high score, and that's fine. But when I started making games that were hits, they were because they made people laugh out loud. They made it because they were 2 or 3 people playing against each other, either against each other or 2 of them teaming up against the computer. And it was more engaging for everybody. And quite frankly, it's easier to design a game where the players themselves are providing the fun. We create the vehicle that they can use to create that fun, but they're going to do things that, honestly, as designers, we didn't necessarily anticipate, that makes them laugh out loud even more, pump in that next quarter even faster.
I don't know if there's any truth to this rumor or not, but there's another podcast I used to listen to, but unfortunately they stopped doing it years ago. But they had an episode where they were talking about arcades, and I think the mentality back then is that no game players should be able to last more than, like, I think about a minute to a minute and a half per quarter. Because again, the arcade owners want you to keep pumping quarters in there. And supposedly, now didn't Bally Midway, they made Defender, didn't they?
No, unfortunately, here's the big thing. If we go through my tenure, my early 10 years of arcades, about 89, the 2 big arcade companies out of Chicago were Bally Midway and Williams Electronics. Williams Electronics did great games, and they were our biggest competitor. They did Defender. They did, very different games from us, and they were all about high score and getting that someone off in a minute and a half. And sometimes they did it very well. Some people just made the game harder and angered players. And then the players, and I'm not talking about Williams or Bally, I'm just saying different developers had different ways to do that. So yes, no, Bally Midway did not do Defender. However, whenever you see a Midway game collection, all of Bally Midway's early games, including mine, are in that collection, but it's really Midway, who was Williams Electronics, bought Bally Midway in 1989 and then took the Midway name and then put all the old Williams games in that same collection called a Midway game collection. So Defender was a Williams game that now is, everybody in the world thinks all those early Williams games are Bally Midway games, and they were not. They just bought the name Bally Midway when I was halfway through Arch Rivals.
Probably the reason I thought about that is my son has one of the arcade 1-up machines with Rampage on it, and it also has Defender on it, so that's where I got confused. But this other podcast I was used to listen to, I guess there was this rumor that when someone applied to be a game designer at Williams, they would put them in front of a Defender machine and say, okay, 1 quarter, whatever your score is, that's your salary. So I don't know if there was any truth to that rumor, but
I don't know. When we were, myself, Jeff Nauman, the same guy I did Rampage with, we were doing Arch Rivals, which was brand new gameplay style. You controlled multiple basketball players. You could call for a pass, and then we added personal fouls and punching and pantsing them because it was more fun that way. We were 3/4 of the way through that game when Williams bought Bally Midway. We finished and then myself and Jeff were the only 2 video designers they kept after a multi-million-dollar buyout. And then we learned shortly thereafter, and I've just had it confirmed here in the last couple of years, sales from Arch Rivals when we finished the game for the new Williams Bally Midway paid for the buyout. That's how popular that game was. So most of what I know about Williams is after 1989, because then now we were working for Williams Bally Midway. Bally Midway, Williams was a different type of game style than the early Bally Midway group. And Williams was a different kind of game development setup. The management at Williams pitted each of its developers against each other. By the time I was working there, all the different teams said, hey, come work with us, because don't work with these other guys. Whereas at the Bally Midway, it was all, hey, everybody helped everybody else. So it was a very different kind of working environment, because I had been thinking the whole world that's making video games is all kind of, we're all buddies and we're all going to lunch together and we're all going having fun. And it was not necessarily that way at other companies. Every company, I'm sure, had very different ways of doing things. My way, in talking to people over the years, the way it was at early Bally Midway was a lot more peer-to-peer, we're all in this together, than it was at other companies.
Now, one of the earlier games you worked on, and this was one of my personal favorite games from back in the day, and again, one of them that I lost no small amount of quarters to, was Spy Hunter. So what was your role in the development of Spy Hunter?
Well, as I said, when I first got hired, I was working on multiple games at once. Disc of Tron was my first really game where I did all the art and animation. But at the same time, I'm working on with Sharon Perry, Sharon Barr then, what's her name, was one of the animators that taught me how to use the tools. And another animator that had just got hired, Steve Olstead and Kevin O'Connor, who was like the head of the animation department. We were all working on Spy Hunter as well as other games. And within that game, where that programmer was working on fine-tuning the speeds, but almost everything else in the game beyond, hey, these are cars, and beyond the theme of, you've got guns and you've got smoke coming out the back. My role was on that game as an animator was mainly special effects, but over the months and months of working on it, the animators came up with things. Okay, we're going to add helicopters. Okay, we're going to add limousines with shotguns that solve, and they were all about solving specific game development problems or issues that came up, and that programmer was very receptive to that kind of stuff. So the game became very rich, and it's also the first game where myself as a non-game player and a not particularly skillful one understood the concept of in the zone. Because that was that game where, okay, I've made it this far, I've got into the weapons van, I pull out with my weapons, and the music changes, and I'm flying along, and I finally understand I'm going to live together. I'm in the zone. And then, bam, somebody takes you out, and it's like, oh, man. Spy Hunter was a wonderful, wonderful game. Wonderful game. But I wasn't technically a game designer, but a lot of us contributed to that game, and it helped me learn to see how important it was that everybody in the team have the high end. The main objective on working on any game should be make this as fun as you can for the player. Don't just focus on what you've been asked to do. Look at it like a player wants to see it. Look at it as if I was spending money when I'm testing it there in the office while we're playing it. I can always walk back to my office and go, oh, this game sucks, and not care about it. But if everybody cares, it becomes a better project, and even better, it becomes more fun to work on.
One of the things I've always wondered is the Nintendo version port of the game. It had like a picture of a plane and a motorcycle on, as well as the boat and the car. So there was this rumor going around the schoolyard back when I was a kid that you played the game long enough, there was actually a mode where you could go into a plane or a motorcycle. Now, just out of curiosity, were there ever any plans to give maybe the person who did the cover for the Sunsoft, they were the company that did the NES version, maybe they were just taking artistic liberty, but were there ever any plans to make other modes for the car other than the boat?
No. Like I said, the whole boat, all transferring all its weapons into nautical versions of the same weapon, that all came from myself and Steve Olstead, another animator in there, who said the game didn't really go anywhere, didn't have an end. In those early days, we didn't have enough juice in our EPROMs, enough art space to do the big kind of, hey, here's the big end of the game. And this game wasn't going anywhere. It got harder, it got more challenging. We did everything we could. And then we decided, hey, give us an EEPROM that can hold this much more art, and we can do a whole water version. And then on the home game side of that, your guess on the school ground was as good as anybody else's, because nobody, generally speaking, no one at Bally Midway, especially in those days, had anything to do with home games. The hardware that we worked on was proprietary hardware that Bally Midway created, and that when someone would do it for a home system, they had to get their programmers to kind of copy it, emulate whatever we did, and they had what they had to work with. That's why some Rampage home games only had 2 monsters. And so if somebody in a home game had decided they had enough space to add a plane, I couldn't tell you. I've never played any of my games as console games. Even though I had the consoles for my kids, I had the arcade games in my basement. So I don't know what they might have done what they may have done in a particular console version, but a lot of it was just artistic license.
Yeah, and I'd have to say one of the things I liked about Spy Hunter is the couple of the sound effects really added tension to the game. Whenever I heard the sound of the helicopter or the switchblades, that always just got me, on edge.
Right. The helicopters was another thing. The animators just, we walked in, Tom, hey, how about if we do this and we can have missiles coming down from above? And then, I love the sound of the, what were they? They're tire slashers that popped out of the tires. Those were great. And I'll say one more thing about the sound too. There were two, that game had 2 sound designers working on it, a guy named Neil Falconer and a guy named Bob Libby. And Neil did I believe both of those guys worked on it, but Neil did the first ever that I know of real-time jazz generator. So beyond the Peter Gunn theme, which everybody knows, that wonderful jazz thing that just goes on and on while you're driving, that was a jazz generator that was generating it on the fly, different every time. I thought that was so brilliant.
Video game music, I mean, that's just something that's so amazing how far that's come as well, because, it started out, of course, as the beeps and the boops. And then of course, once we got to the 16-bit era, at least for the home systems, then it started to sound a little closer to real music. And now they can just have, live orchestras and rock bands and stuff do the music. So that's something that I've always loved video game music.
Well, in those early days too, I mean, shout out to the musicians I've worked with. And I mean, one guy I worked with said it really well is, it's harder than creating. You can't just compose this long piece because you don't know what the player's going to do. Is he going to walk through door A or door B? And the music's got to be completely different. So he's got that kind of double challenge of, okay, I've got to make this dynamic, but be able to change at a moment or a beat's notice. I'm not talking about sound effects here now. I'm talking about music, and now you've got to send out this whole different feeling, add suspense, add humor, and it was just those early days were so much fun.
It seems like it probably was a lot friendlier, more enjoyable environment back then, because I mean, some of the stuff I've heard about game companies now with the crunch, which I'm sure there was crunch back then, but hearing stories about how nowadays, well, of course, with games for the home consoles, they usually don't get released complete, like the good old days. You had usually moment you put your game in your Xbox or PlayStation, you have to download a gigabyte worth of updates because they didn't complete the game. So I don't know. Did they have a lot of crunch back in your days?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand what you mean by the word crunch.
Usually something like there's like a release date of, let's say, September 1st, and they've only got like 80%.
If you're talking about deadlines, one of the things that I was very adamant about was maintaining deadlines. If we had to have a game out by September 1st, that meant we had to finish it, for all intents and purposes, 2 months early. because then it has to go out on, or we have to have it done by September 1st. It's going to go out 2 months later or not go out based on 6 to 8 weeks of testing. So we, the developers that wanted this thing to go into production, we had to have the best possible game by September 1st, because once it went out on test, it was the number of quarters it brought in. Because that's what a lot of people don't understand. What I did and what the arcade industry was about was those quarters. Home games didn't care. Mm-hmm. They didn't. I mean, not that they didn't care about what they were doing, and they made some wonderful, wonderful, fantastic games, but they didn't have to, especially in the earlier days, have to get anything out there. And when it was released, you bought it. They got the money they're going to get. They don't care if you play it once or you play it 1,000 times. If they're lucky, it gets good press and they sell 1,000 copies, but that's 1,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 copies. But that's what they get. Mm-hmm. We had to get the money and it had to keep coming in. So a game that's a hit for a month is not the same as a hit that lasts 5 years, 10 years, and is still out there today in bowling alleys or whatever like that, because it just kept mm-hmm. playing and it just kept entertaining. It was a whole different thing. But we were very... And by we, I mean most of the teams and games I worked with at Bally, and they were always teams. I mean, it's not one guy. It's a team. Sometimes as small as 3, sometimes 5 or 6 people were working on it at once. But for the most part, we hit our deadlines, because if we didn't, some of the guys down on the production line, they get laid off because there's nothing coming off the line right now. Mm-hmm. So we were much more interested in hitting our marks. And, their work, and you talk about crunch times, for me and guys I worked with on, games like Rampage and Xenophobe and Demo Derby and Sarge and Arch Rivals and Pigskin and anything. Crunch time was that was month and a half, 6 weeks, 2 months before you go out on test. And you didn't mind sleeping in the office on a cot, because you wanted every possible great thing you could do for the game to be in the game. So that was definitely crunch time, but we never delivered a project out that wasn't finished. Now, occasionally may have delivered 1 or 2 out with a bug in it that you had to fix and send out operators new ROMs. Oh, what? We found this. That's happened to me once or twice too. But for the most part, we were the people driving ourselves to do crunch time, to do okay, we got to stay late. We got to call our wives. I'll be home at 9. I'll be home at 11. I'll be home. I'm not coming home tonight, hon. And that was what it was about, because we were all excited. We were all enthused.
Now, you mentioned Xenophobe, which is another one of my games that, like I said, I lost a lot of quarters to back in the day. What was your role in the development of that game?
I came up with it. Games like I started becoming a designer officially. I did a game called Geekery, which was a Dungeons and Dragons game. And management, like I said, didn't for the most part call anybody a designer. And they were showing Nolan Bushnell through our offices. And my game happened to be in the office. And they walked by and said, and this is our new game, Geekery. And here's the designer, Brian Colin. They'd never called me that before. And I ran out the next day and changed my business cards. So it was... As a game like Xenophobe, I had the big success with Rampage, which I came up with, which I figured out how to do on hardware where they said it couldn't be done. And then because that was the highest earning video game of all time at that time, they said, we got to do another 3-player game. So I had also come up with a way to fake scrolling. And if you remember Xenophobe, it was 3 levels and 3-player game, and each player had their own horizontal screen so they could all go in different directions and team up and kill all the aliens on the planet or on the spaceship or wherever they happen to be. And so my role in that was coming up with the way to do the fake scrolling on hardware that didn't scroll, coming up with the theme, because I had just seen the movie Aliens, as you can probably guess, and then doing all the art and animation
Yeah.
like on other games. And then Rampage was the first game where they let me do the cabinet art too. So after Rampage, I did the cabinet art as well. Not just the screen art, the animation, game concept. I also got to do the cabinet art on and control panel art on Rampage and Xenophobe and Pigskin and Arch Rivals and everything.
And I'd have to say one of my favorite things about Xenophobe is I did like the 3 split screens and how, you could all stay together and work as a team, or, go at it alone. And of course, the problem when you working together as a team is everyone was always fighting over the better weapons.
Yes. And again, that was by design. Because like I think I mentioned briefly earlier, multiplayer games lets people create their own fun. And again, and with a 3-player game, 2-player games, head-to-head games, that's a fairly common thing. But the 3-player, after Rampage, the fact that the 2 of you might be friends and this third guy comes up and nobody quite knows where they stand with each other adds to this element of with Xenophobe, people fought over, the weapons. People would be in different places. They'd try to, they'd rush and try to transport in or take the elevator to where the other guy was if he was in trouble. People could call for help. Other people didn't care. They're just walking around shooting aliens. But it made every game a very different experience depending on who you were playing with, which was always, as those of us old enough to remember know, that was the beauty of the arcade. But other than that, the things, like I mentioned earlier, players want to live forever. Operators want me off in a minute and a half. Things like, you didn't die in Rampage, if you recall. You were a human that turned into a monster, and at the end you turned into a little naked person. The reason for that was I felt that crawling off naked was funny. We like that because you just died basically, but you lost your quarter. But if you put in a new quarter before you got off, you would turn back into the monster and you'd get to keep your score. That was something we planned on, and that was a good way to get that quarter real quickly. What we didn't count on that players did themselves was player number 3, Lizzie just shrinks down. Ralph and George both go, "She's human, eat her." So then they would jump off their buildings to try to eat the player that was crawling off, and that player had to reach for their quarter even faster. So players themselves drove the earnings of that thing up in ways we didn't even count on.
Yes, my preteen self did definitely find the fact that your characters in Rampage became little naked humans. Yes, I did find that funny back in the day.
And then you were saying, I do got to tell you something about Xenophobe, though, if you don't mind. You learn a lot of lessons. Like you say, one of the lessons we learned, which would be surprising to people, is I did Xenophobe with a brand new programmer on the floor. It was supposed to be, as you know, many things you could find and then use elsewhere. You could find the disc and put it in the slot and stop the clock, or you could, push this here and it would transport you somewhere else, or it would call in a little machine to bring in new weapons. There were hundreds of those things, and everything you found was supposed to be able to be used somewhere else. We got to the last, to our 8 weeks away from production. It went out on test and made so much money in the first 2 weeks that management said, okay, we're going straight into production. And I'm like, no, we've only got about a third of the things that are supposed to happen in this game. And I got to tell you, if you can get a copy of the EEPROM, you'll see a ton of art in that game, including spacesuits and other types of robots that never got put in the game because it made so much money on test when it first went out. Management rushed it out the door 6 weeks ahead of schedule. And I would have never believed that would ever happen, but it always bothers me about Xenophobe that there's still so much in it that never got to get into the game.
Yeah, because I remember we were talking about it at Midwest Gaming Classic back in 2023, and I noticed you had like a piece of artwork in the background, and one of the characters was wearing like a suit that you mentioned was supposed to protect you from heat. What are some of the other stuff that was cut from the game?
Uh, Virtually the little packets of seeds that you could pick up. If you went to this one area, you were supposed to be able to plant them. And then the next time you walked in that room, there'd be corn that you could eat and restore health, things like that. The spacesuits were supposed to, you were on the planets, you could run around the top surface of the moon or the planet. But in the design, you were supposed to find the spacesuit first before you went up top. Otherwise, you would choke to death. So we had to take that out because we never got the spacesuits in. Yeah, no, there was a ton of stuff. I'd have to be looking at a printout of all the art to go into different types of robots that would come in with different types of weapons, different types of explosions. We did get all the monsters in, which I'm glad about.
It would be interesting to see if, and I'm sure this probably wouldn't happen, but now who owns the rights to Xenophobe? Is it Williams now, or?
No, it went to Williams when they bought Bally Midway, and then Williams changed its name to Midway, and then got partnered up with some California groups, grew bigger and bigger, and were eventually bought out by Time Warner. So Time Warner owns everything done by guys like me. We did the games, but we were employees. We don't have any rights to the games. So as much as I would love to redo Xenophobe and put all that stuff in there, Warner Brothers would have to call me up and ask me to do it.
Because I was about to say, what would be awesome is, since it sounds like you guys put a lot of time and energy and love into that game, which definitely showed, is if you could someday release a director's cut version, which does have all the stuff that you wanted in there, so we could see the game as you originally envisioned it.
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, people ask that about a lot of my earlier games, my arcade games, but yeah, talk to Time Warner. Call them, make them your next call, and see if you can. I mean, that's why the movie Rampage got made. Rampage was a Warner Brothers film because they had the license, and that was fun too. 30 years after the original Rampage, to be out on the set when they're finishing up the film was incredible.
So let's talk about Rampage next, and we have talked about it before. So what did you say earlier, this was the first game you were on as a designer?
No, Geekery was the first game where they called me a designer.
Okay.
This was a game. Rampage came about because I had seen big background animations, and our hardware, they weren't going to spend the money to give us animating backgrounds. And in the game Geekery, I had done some large characters, like double, triple size of the normal sprite. And I was saying in a meeting, there were 4 or 5 of us in the room. And I'm like talking to one of the guys who'd been there the longest. And he's like, they're not going to, I was like, I want animating backgrounds. Why can't Brian, they're not going to give you animating backgrounds. They're not going to pay for it. But what, Brian, they're not going to, finally, Brian, you can move a rectangle. You know that. What are you going to do with a moving rectangle? So I thought about it for a second, and then I turned to Sharon, the other animator, and I said, okay. So we make a giant moving rectangle. We move it down into itself, put some foreground dust at the bottom so it looks like a building collapsing. And what knocks down buildings? With great big monsters. And that movement, everybody in the room knew we had next year's #1 game. I even put it as the first line in the game write-up. This is why this is going to be next year's #1 game. Took it to our boss, and he said no. So I didn't take no for an answer. I went to the head of engineering. I said, look, this is what we want to do. He laughed. He thought it was funny. I said, so we can do this? No. And upper management, top 3 guys, no. And I mean, in hindsight, I think they were worried because, he said, you can't eat policemen. You can't eat people. You can't be the bad guy. Because remember, back in those days, video games got a lot of bad press. If someone was putting an arcade into a community, the community was erupt because it was going to bring in greasers and bikers and hellions from out of town. So management was just no. And Jeff Nauman, the programmer and the guy who helped did, Arch Rivals with and other games, I called him in and said, can we do this? If we do it like this and move these blocks, he's like, absolutely. We started on it anyway, just to prove that we could do it. And by a total accident that had nothing to do with us, the top 3 guys at Bally Midway were fired by Bally. And the new guy that was coming in hadn't been to the office yet. He sent around a memo and said, don't worry, everybody. This is just an upper management change. I've got an open door. Everybody's job is safe. I've got an open door policy. You can guess who was waiting outside his door on his very first day at the office, because he said he had an open door policy and I was there. I pitched him Rampage. He said yes. And that went on to make more money than any game had ever made. So if it hadn't been for him, it wouldn't have happened. Now,
did you, before Rampage, did you ever watch a lot of like monster movies? And did that have any?
I was a filmmaker. I made Ray Harryhausen was, one of my heroes. Because I was a filmmaker and an animator, I did a lot of stop motion animated films, as well as, one of my favorites was when we called The Creature from the Green Latrine as a stop motion monster movie. So yes, I was very, and I was more of a classic monster guy. As a little kid, monster movies scared the heck out of me. So I was but I was very comfortable with like the magic and the romance and the mood of a Dracula or a Bride of Frankenstein or the early Universal films. I was never much of a fan of the Godzilla, even though everybody always says, oh, the lizard in Rampage is based on Godzilla. It's like, no, Godzilla towered over buildings. Lizzie in Rampage was actually based on the Ymir from 20 million miles to Earth that Ray Harryhausen did the monster for. So yeah, I was a big monster movie fan, but of a particular type.
I mean, I've seen a few of the Harryhausen movies, and my younger self definitely was impressed by some of the stop animation in there, like the skeletons and Jason and the Argonauts. And then one of my favorite movies, I think. Now did he do the effects on Clash of the Titans?
Yeah. The early one. Yeah, the first ones, yes. Yeah. No, he did, tremendous stuff.
What are some of your thoughts on the Rampage movie?
I liked it. I knew it wasn't going to be my silly eat the guy in the toilet with on the toilet video game, but I was really happy with the way they kept the heart in George. It didn't turn into just a big kaiju movie, and by keeping the heart in George, they kept the humanity. Because, like I said, when I came up with the concept for the game, these monsters were just people who had been turned into these monsters by scum labs, horrible, not by ecological concerns, because I was a college student in the 70s. So ecological concerns were something that was big back then. And the growth of cities to me back then was way out of control, even back then to me. So the idea of an ecological result of having, or a bad environmental result like bad food or bad water or chemicals, turning these people into monsters who then would take down the cities, seemed like a beautiful, I don't know if it's ironic, but just kind of everything came full circle. And I love the fact that the movie kept the heart in George, and then I thought The Rock did a great job. It stayed a comedy. Everything about it was great. And then they called me up one day and said, would I be an extra in Chicago when they were shooting in Chicago? So I'm like, absolutely. It doesn't get any better than this. And then one of the assistant director found out I designed the game. So he shot a cameo of me running away from the Sears Tower as it's falling down. And then I get a call from the director a few weeks later who said, I've been wanting to call you for a while and they can't stop me. So, because you're an employee now, you're an extra. You want to come down to meet everybody at the studio during the last week of filming. So yeah, it was wonderful. And They were all fantastic to me. I got to go to the premiere. I had friends that saw my cameo in early screenings of the film. So I'm sitting at the premiere with my wife, and I'm going, okay, here it comes. Here it comes. This is it. Here it comes. Hey, what? So at the after party, the producer comes up to me and says, sorry, Brian, Warner came in 3 weeks ago, cut 30 minutes out, and you ended up on the cutting room floor. So I never got to see the finished cameo, but I have footage of it that other extras were shooting while I was doing it. So at least I've got that to do it. But really, everybody associated with that movie were wonderful. The Rock is, everybody says what a nice guy is. He is truly a wonderful, wonderful guy. He was, Naomi Harris was, everybody I met was wonderful. Jason Liles, who actually was the human playing playing George. Everybody was wonderful, and it was just a great honor to meet them all. And they treated me like royalty, where actually what I felt like was a 5-year-old kid in the presence of gods. It was wonderful.
That would have been cool if they did do a scene where, like, you know, they rip open a window or something and there's like a cactus there and one of the monsters accidentally eats it. Or
yeah. Now, spoken like a Rampage player, because I get that a lot.
Yeah. Or if they would have had something where, like, they were punching a train back and forth. That was always one of the best parts of the game.
Again, that was Jeff and I saying, we've created this world, but the players are going to provide their own entertainment. So yeah, let's punching that. Let's let them play ping pong with the subway card or the train stuff. You know, we wanted laughter, because in terms of getting players to put in another quarter, whenever they were out on test for weeks, we'd be in the back of the arcade watching and seeing what made you put in quarters certain games. And for me, I always felt laughter was the best way to do that. I will say the movie did one thing that I didn't realize till I was at the premiere. But if you played Rampage, and there are a lot of secret bits in Rampage, both Rampage and Rampage World Tour, the lady in the red dress, if George grabbed her, all the army guys he would hold her, he wouldn't eat her. And all the army guys and everybody shooting at you in the helicopters would stop shooting as long as you held the girl in the red dress. In the movie, at the end of the movie, I don't mean to spoil it for you, but the main villainess in the movie, and she was beautiful. She played the part so well. At the end of the movie, George is holding her and he throws her into the air, opens his mouth, and I'm at the premiere and I screamed out loud, "She's wearing a red dress!" My wife elbows me in the ribs as hard as she can, because the filmmakers realized it and put in that bit that maybe nobody in the world would even know except I did. But it made me feel so wonderful.
Nice. So you've been around in the arcade industry and video game industry for quite a while. What advice would you give to someone who wants to enter into this industry?
Real simple. There's a lot of tools right now that you can use, and you can make a game by yourself. If you've got a little art talent, little music talent, little coding talent, or even not, there's a lot of great tools that you don't have to spend thousands and tens of thousands of dollars on. But don't. Do what you can on your own. Figure out what you're good at. And whatever you do, but do it with people because if you want to be a designer, probably the biggest unsung part of your job is keeping other people enthused about your idea. You got to pitch it to them. You got to make them see what you see is right about it. You got to listen to them, because they're going to find things that are wrong about it that you didn't know. So as a designer, if you want to be a designer, talking to people, encouraging them, keeping them happy. And then the best way to do that, whatever you're going to do, start small. Don't go out and say, I'm going to do Lord of the Rings. Don't go out and say, I'm going to do this wonderful involved thing that has this long story plot. Bounce a ball. Figure out what you can do to bounce a ball and make it funny. Maybe it's the art, maybe it's the music, maybe it's the way the ball farts when it hits the ground. Finish that. The people you're working with and you will be happy that you finished it, and they will work with you again on something bigger. You got a new idea you want to put into it? If you can't get it in there right away and quickly, save it for your next game, because getting a game finished pumps the team up so much, builds your confidence so much, and you also learn from your mistakes. The next game can be bigger, and the next game can be bigger. But there's nothing worse than getting a bunch of enthusiastic people together, or even a few, and then not finishing it because you tried to do too much or because it dragged on too long. Believe me, almost all of my earlier games and most of the games I've created over the last 40 years, and I've created over 90, helped create over 90, almost all of them came out on time or ahead of schedule. When they don't, it's because the team's not enthused, or something happened that made it drag on longer than it should have. A 1-year project turns into a 3-year project. By the 3rd year, it's almost impossible to keep someone excited about it because it's had so many changes coming from one direction or another. Or you had to get on new people because this person found a better job across the street at a bigger game company. Keep your stuff small. And then when I'm hiring people for my company, I always look for something they made on their own. They're made outside of school rather than inside of school. Inside of school is valuable. If you go to school for video games, they will teach you things. They're not necessarily things you can't learn on your own, but it always impresses me more if somebody says, I did this with 2 buddies. Even if it doesn't look as polished as something else, I'm looking at someone who's taking on the responsibility for getting it done. Okay, that went on longer than I meant it to, but you can cut out whatever you don't need.
Oh no, that's okay. And I think that's good advice, because especially when you have platforms like Steam, and for some of the consoles out there, I guess they do actually accept independently produced games. Do you think it would be easier to get a game out to the public in today's market than back when you first started?
No, absolutely not. That's why I say I was blessed. I was lucky. I was an employee. I wasn't working at Target in the daytime and then working with friends on the weekend remotely. I was in a room with all the other people working on it. It was much easier, and I was getting paid to do it by a company that made them. So I don't have the experience for the most part, although I've had, it's changed over the years, but the game, I was much easier for me back then. It's a lot easier to make a game now. I'm not the right guy to ask how difficult it is to get it sold or to get it released. I'm sure most of your listeners that are making games or thinking about making games know more than I do about that, because I'm a game maker. I don't publish my games. I get hired to make them by publishers. I get hired to make them by clients. So I never really have to deal with that side of things. I've had to deal with it very little. Now, when I was talking about what you need to do if you want to become a game designer, that's advice about making a small game for you that you can show to someone to get a job. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. Is if you've already got a good team and you've found somebody to give you the money and you're an indie, I can't tell you how to do that. You've got a better idea how to do that than I do. I guess I answered that question both ways. Is yes, it was easier for me, and I don't know. I can give you what I think you need to do to design a good game and move forward as a designer. I unfortunately can't give anybody advice on how they actually get it published. Like you say, what I know about Steam is what you know about Steam. There's a way there to do it. And I know I've got friends who they have published their own handmade PlayStation games. So I know it's possible, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know who they knew to get it done.
So you've mentioned that you've worked on about 90 games. What would you say is your favorite, or is there one that you're really, really proud of how it came out?
Well, Rampage would be the one I probably the proudest of, because it did reach the most people. And much to my surprise, a few years ago, people still play it, and new generations people still remember it from that long ago, and people still play it. They play it with their grandkids. So that's probably easily and that's the first one where I got to do everything. It's still a team, and but I got to contribute to it, and I did press marketing and everything for that game. It was a wonderful, wonderful game. So that's my signature game. The game I did a game called Arctic Stud Poker Run, that is, I think, my favorite game to play, but it was a LAN game I did in the early part of this century, where it was full contact, deathmatch, interactive poker, deathmatch racing poker game on heavily armed, rocket powered snowmobiles in a Cthulhu mythos reality. And we only sold like 100,000 copies, but but as a multiplayer game, it was hysterically fun. And to this day, it's still probably my favorite game to play of any game I've ever made. But again, that's where you're playing with 5 other people, and that makes the game even more fun.
So what are some current projects that you're working on now?
I'm only working on one at the moment. I'm working on a sequel to, after we did Arch Rivals and Pigskin for Williams Valley Midway, I was contacted for about a year by EA, who wanted me to come to work in California, and I didn't want to move to California. I have a house and kids and family here, and a big on some wooded land, and I knew I couldn't afford that in California, and the remote wasn't a thing. They didn't want to let me work remotely. So after about a year, they said, "What if we just gave you the money to start your own video game company?" I said, "What?" "Oh, okay." And my partner at that time, Jeff Nauman, and I left Valley Midway under good terms and created Game Refuge. And our first game for EA was a Sega Genesis game called General Chaos. And it was very successful. It was one of their most popular non-licensed games, like original games that they put out. It's the reason the 4-player adapter was created for the Sega Genesis. We're working on a sequel for it right now, 30 some years later. We're more than halfway through. We've been forced to, it's been taking longer than I like, because I'm basically it's a personal project. I'm paying for it out of my Social Security money. And the people working on it with me are people who are some very talented arcade creators who are working for next to nothing, just because we all want to get it done. We've been working remotely. We're going to try and move into one office here in the next couple of months. I'm hoping by November 1st. We're going to be doing a crowdfunder to get the money to move everybody into one office and all the part-timers into full-time. But then I'm hoping 6 months later, General Chaos 2, Major Snafu is going to be out in the world.
Do you have any website or social networking links you'd like to share?
I never remember those, but I have a little thing over here. So I'm on Facebook, of course. Brian F. Colin is I'm on Facebook. My company website, which hasn't been updated since I think before like 2017 or something. But my company website is Game Refuge. My company website is www.gamerefuge.com. And on there, go to Along the Way. That'll give you a detailed look at about 50 or 60 of the games I've done over the last 43 years now. And then what else? Oh, General Chaos fan page is on Facebook. It's just called General Chaos fan page. And then the, let's see, on Facebook also is, General Chaos Major Snafu. We just put that one out there a couple days ago. So that's out there. So you can go to any of those places. And if you ever want any original art from any of the games I've created over the years, I have a Square store that's at https GameRefugeInc.com. .square site. Game Refuge Inc. has a little. You'll find it if you want it. If you care, you'll find this stuff. And if you don't, I'm sorry for blathering on like this.
Yeah, and I understand you also make a lot of regular appearances at various conventions as well.
Okay, can I plug those too, or are we way past our time limit?
Oh, that's fine. Yes. No, that's fine.
Okay. In the next few weeks, I'm going to be at Michigan City on the last weekend in September. The next weekend, I'm going to be at PGX Pittsburgh in Monroeville, Pennsylvania. On the following weekend, the first weekend in October, first weekend in November, I'm going to be in Effingham, Illinois at the Effing Con, and you gotta love that name. and then a few weeks after that, or the next week after that, I'm going to be in Detroit, and then the week before Thanksgiving, I'm going to be at Free Play, Florida. And at all of those places, I will be bringing posters, figures, stickers. I have a big display, and I answer questions about anything. And if you have any of my memorabilia, I never charge for autographs. So come up, bring me your ports. I'm happy to sign them. I'm happy to take pictures. I don't charge for any of that stuff. I love meeting people that played the games and remember them fondly, and I'd love to see you at any of those shows.
So I'd like to thank you for joining me today, Brian, and thank you everyone for listening. And until next time, have a wonderful day. You have been listening to a presentation of Point of Insanity Game Studio. Visit us on the web at www.poigamestudio.com. Follow me on most social media sites at POI Game Studio, and check out my music channel on YouTube at Al Seeger Music.